In the final days of the Third Reich, Germany's descent into hell. In the final days of the Third Reich, Germany sank into a hell of fire and despair. The vengeance that descended upon its people in 1945 made no distinction between soldiers and civilians, punishing both the innocent and the guilty with the same brutality. Berlin and Königsberg, reduced to rubble, became the scenes of indescribable horror, where fear and resignation could be felt in every corner. The macabre joke circulating in Berlin in late 1944, "Be practical, give a coffin," illustrated the grim reality of a population no longer expecting salvation. Amid the incessant bombings, extreme scarcity, and certainty of defeat, dark humor became a reflection of collective anguish. One of the most terrifying episodes of this tragedy occurred in Demmin, a city marked by panic and despair. When the Red Army stormed in 1945, its inhabitants, terrified by the atrocities committed in East Prussia and Silesia, chose the only escape they believed possible. Berlin in the storm, the last resistance of National Socialism. In the early months of 1945, the pressure from the Allies in the West and the advance of the Red Army in the East crumbled the defenses of the Third Reich. The Wehrmacht had suffered continuous defeats, and the Battle of the Bulge in January had failed, leaving Germany without operational capacity. On January 12th, the Vistula-Oder offensive began, allowing Soviet forces to advance toward the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The Führerbunker's defensive strategy focused on mobilizing the Volkssturm, an improvised militia. The SS executed any officer who suggested surrender. In March, British and American forces crossed the Rhine, capturing key cities like Cologne and Frankfurt. On April 16th, the Soviet offensive on Berlin began with a coordinated attack by three Red Army fronts. The First Belarusian Front, under Georgy Zhukov from the east, the First Ukrainian Front, led by Ivan Konev from the south, and the Second Belarusian Front, commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky from the north. The German defense on the Silo Heights was insufficient. 5 days later, the first Soviet units reached the suburbs of Berlin, where German resistance fragmented into isolated pockets. Urban combat between soldiers and civilians intensified street by street and house by house as Hitler's orders became erratic and his command structure collapsed. 4 days later, Soviet troops had completely encircled Berlin. The city was now fully isolated. On April 29th, Hitler wrote his political will and married Eva Braun, before committing suicide the following day. In the document, he designated Karl Dönitz as his successor and denounced Göring and Himmler as traitors. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered to the Red Army. Germany's official capitulation was signed on May 7th in Reims before Dwight Eisenhower and ratified on May 8th in Berlin-Karlshorst before the Soviet High Command. This marked the total collapse of the National Socialist regime and the dissolution of its party. The Gestapo and the SS were declared criminal organizations, and their members were pursued judicially. Many high-ranking officers attempted to escape to South America or the Middle East through clandestine networks known as the rat lines. Most German scientists and technicians were recruited by the United States and the Soviet Union in technology transfer programs. The occupied zones were administered by the Allies in 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. In Berlin, approximately 2.7 million people remained at the start of the battle. This means that during the war, the population had been reduced by almost half. Millions of soldiers were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps, where conditions were less than optimal, and many prisoners suffered from hunger, cold, and exhaustion due to forced labor. Their return began in the 2 years after the cessation of hostilities, but a few did not return from the Soviet Union until January 1956. The greatest difficulty these repatriates faced was their inability to reintegrate into their family and professional lives. Meanwhile, the civilian population faced the consequences of years of propaganda and loyalty to the regime. The Soviet occupation was marked by reprisals and summary executions, while in the West, denazification programs were implemented. The latter had limited success in eradicating Nazi ideas. Despite the Allied efforts, sectors of society maintained an ambiguous attitude toward the Nazi past. In fact, in the post-war period, Some former members of the dissolved party occupied positions in public administration and industry, sparking controversy in the country's historical memory. The Nuremberg trials, initiated in November 1945, set legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes. In these courts, the main surviving Nazi leaders were tried, establishing the culpability of the regime's high command in events and phenomena such as the Holocaust. Documentary evidence and testimonies revealed the magnitude of what happened, including the genocide of millions in concentration camps. The firestorm, consequences of the bombings in German cities. Throughout the conflict, Germany was the scene of an aerial bombing campaign carried out by the Allied forces, designed to weaken the Nazi regime's military capacity and break the morale of the population. These efforts began to intensify in 1942, with the implementation of the Area Bombing Directive by the Royal Air Force, RAF. This strategy, known as area bombing, aimed to attack densely populated urban areas, with the goal of inflicting large-scale damage to homes, city centres and industrial facilities. The strategies reflected a dual approach. On one hand, the British RAF focused its efforts on massive night attacks, while the United States Army Air Force, USAAF, opted for more precise daylight raids against specific targets. Coordination between both forces was consolidated in 1943 during the Casablanca Conference, where the combined air offensive policy was adopted. This approach allowed for constant pressure on the national territory, intensifying damage to both industrial and civilian fronts. The tactics used included the deployment of incendiary bombs, designed to cause uncontrollable fires in densely populated urban areas. The American forces, for their part, employed bombers like the Boeing B-17, which had the range to penetrate deep into enemy territory and target factories, refineries, and transportation hubs vital to the war effort. Hamburg, an important urban and industrial center, suffered the first coordinated use of both air forces in 1943 during Operation Gomorrah. Although the combined day and night attacks began on July 24th and lasted until August 3rd, the heaviest attack occurred on the night of July 27th to 28th, when 739 British bombers dropped more than 100,000 explosive and incendiary bombs. The densely populated working-class neighborhoods of eastern Hamburg, including Hamm, Hammerbrook and Rothenburg-Sort, were affected. The bombing caused a firestorm with temperatures reaching up to 800 degrees Celsius, favored by the heat, drought and concentration of bombs, destroying an area of about 13 square kilometers and causing huge air currents that further fueled the fires. The attacks left behind a glowing landscape of rubble. Around 35,000 people died, including many women and children, and approximately 750,000 were left homeless. About half of all housing in Hamburg was destroyed, either partially or completely. The evacuation of the city began immediately after the attacks, and hundreds of thousands of people fled. One of the most emblematic attacks was carried out by 773 British bombers, which dropped approximately 1,478 tons of explosive bombs and 1,182 tons of incendiary bombs on Dresden between February 13th and 14th, 1945. The following day, new attacks by American bombers dropped an additional 711 tons of bombs. The attacks caused the destruction of much of the city. It is estimated that up to 25,000 people lost their lives. In less than 48 hours, about 90% of the historic center was reduced to rubble, including important historical buildings such as the Frauenkirche, which collapsed on February 15th. In total, estimates indicate that more than 600,000 civilians lost their lives during all the bombings, while millions were left homeless. At the same time, the uncertainty and terror associated with the air raid sirens and the night explosions generated a state of chronic anxiety. In addition to human losses, urban infrastructure suffered the consequences. Transportation systems, including train stations and bridges, were also prioritized targets, interrupting supply lines and hindering the movement of troops and resources. Dortmund and Essen, pillars of the national heavy industry, were systematically attacked as part of the British air offensive known as the Battle of the Ruhr, with the intention of paralyzing the production of weapons and essential materials for the war effort. In Dortmund, it is estimated that 98% of the city centre was destroyed in the attack of March 12, 1945, which severely hindered the administrative and economic functioning of the region. That day, more than 1,000 British bombers dropped over 4,800 tons of bombs. Human losses, difficult to estimate, were in the thousands. The loss of homes forced many families to seek refuge in basements, tunnels and bunkers, while others had to move to rural areas in search of safety. In cities like Darmstadt, the bombings peaked on the night of September 11 to 12, 1944, in the infamous Night of Fire. There, living conditions in temporary shelters became unsustainable. The lack of access to basic services such as drinking water and electricity aggravated the humanitarian crisis, leading to outbreaks of disease and malnutrition. In Dresden, authorities were forced to burn corpses in the open air to prevent the spread of epidemics. Forced movements, the expulsion of Germans in Central and Eastern Europe. In the first half of the 1940s, it is estimated that more than 17 million Germans lived outside the Reich's territory, particularly in the former Eastern territories such as Silesia, East Prussia, and what is now Poland, as well as other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Some had moved during the war years to work in the arms industry or agriculture, while others had arrived due to expulsions or refugee movements. In any case, as the fighting progressed, the forced expulsion of more than 12 million individuals began to take shape in the context of the gradual collapse of Germany on the battlefronts. The reasons for the expulsions were varied. In addition to the desire for revenge for the crimes committed by the Nazi regime, there was a goal of territorial and ethnic reorganization to strengthen the newly forming or re-establishing nation-states. Poland, for example, used the expulsion for almost 7 years to consolidate its control over territories acquired at the end of the war. Initially, the so-called wild expulsions took place, where Polish authorities and local groups forcibly removed Germans from the former Eastern territories, such as Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia. In these regions, they were forced to leave their homes without adequate preparations, exposed to physical abuse and, in some cases, murder. In East Prussia, around 1.5 million people were evacuated via the Baltic Sea, and thousands died in shipwrecks, such as that of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The ship, a passenger vessel used by the Navy to evacuate refugees and soldiers from East Prussia, had over 10,000 people aboard that day, including many German civilians fleeing the advance of the Red Army. The Soviet submarine S-13 spotted it at night and fired 4 torpedoes, 3 of which hit the ship. Within less than an hour, the ship sank in the Baltic Sea. It is estimated that between 4,000 and 9,000 people died, making it one of the most disastrous sinkings in history. Poland justified the measures with the crimes committed by the German occupiers and the need to integrate the country's ethnically empty zones. Additionally, the eastern territories had to serve as compensation for the Polish losses on the eastern border, where Poland had to cede territory to the Soviet Union. The unoccupied territories were used to resettle Poles who had been expelled from these eastern regions. The newly established government in Czechoslovakia under Edvard Benz, for its part, justified the expulsion with the goal of resolving the German problem and ensuring national unity. From January 1946, most Germans in this territory were systematically organized into transports and deported to Germany or Austria. The impact on Czechoslovakia was profound. It led to the depopulation of certain regions and altered the national political landscape, contributing to the consolidation of communist power. The new Hungarian government, under pressure from the Soviet Union, saw this population as a potential threat, and expulsions officially began under a decree in December 1945. This decree regulated the resettlement of all people who had declared their German nationality in the census taken 4 years earlier, or who had been members of National Socialist organizations. The first transports of displaced people began in January. In this initial wave, around 130,000 were detained, expropriated, and sent to the Western occupation zones of Germany. Throughout the process, it is estimated that around 300,000 people were expelled from Hungary. In general, the expulsions were risky and complicated. The escape routes were marked by hunger, disease, and inclement weather, leading to the death of hundreds of thousands of people. The trains were often overcrowded and ill-equipped, while rural roads were filled with families struggling to survive. Some died under fire from fighter planes attacking the evacuation routes. The expelled individuals, often equipped only with what they could carry, were housed in transit camps that lacked basic infrastructure. Faced with the overcrowding of people arriving in eastern Germany, the Allies promoted measures to accelerate the expulsions in an attempt to consolidate territorial changes before the Potsdam Conference. The conference, held in August 1945, formalized the expulsions, establishing the need for an orderly and humane transfer from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. In practice, this directive resulted in mass expulsions that rarely adhered to the established principles. The demographic impact was considerable. With several million displaced people, the ethnic composition of Central and Eastern Europe was radically altered. German communities that had inhabited these regions for centuries disappeared, leaving a population, cultural, and economic void. The forced departure of businessmen, farmers, and artisans had a negative impact on local economies, especially in regions that depended on their expertise and capital. In the following decades, these dynamics would influence migration toward Western Europe and the aging population in the countries of origin. Of the total displacements, it is estimated that between 400,000 and 2 million people died during this period due to harsh conditions and violence. The final destination of the displaced varied by region. In West Germany, the mass arrival of refugees exacerbated social and economic tensions in a country still recovering from the wartime past. The government had to implement policies to integrate the new inhabitants, which eventually contributed to the development of the welfare state and the social market economy. The Soviet offensive in East Prussia, a tale of violence and displacement. The Soviet Red Army offensive in East Prussia, carried out in January of the final year of the war, marked the beginning of a series of documented excesses against civilians, including massacres, sexual violence, and looting. To begin with, the offensive led to a massive flight of the population in East Prussia, under the schemes we have already described. The records of the time document that the Nazis initially prohibited any evacuations, which forced thousands of people to delay their departure until the last moment, increasing the chances of suffering Soviet repression. Amid this situation, deliberate attacks against civilians became frequent. To give an example, after the capture of Mettgetten on February 1, 1945 by the Red Army, numerous civilians, including women and children, were victims of violence and murder. The exact circumstances and the number of victims are subjects of controversy, but when the German troops recaptured the area 19 days later, massive corpses were discovered, many of them with signs of rape and mutilation. An eyewitness, Hermann Sommer, reported several body bags and 2 large piles of bodies containing around 3,000 victims, mostly women and children. Sexual violence became a constant. These actions, often carried out systematically, were both an expression of revenge and a tool of domination. The testimonies gathered recount how women were taken from their shelters to be assaulted in front of their families, who were frequently killed in the process. Looting was part of the destabilization strategy. The Soviet forces ravaged cities such as Königsberg, Danzig, and Allenstein. Soldiers looted public buildings, stores, and private homes. The preferred items were food, clothing, furniture, and valuable personal objects. This behavior, far from being spontaneous, sometimes followed internal directives that sought to deprive them of any resource that could be useful in a potential reconstruction effort. The psychological impact of these experiences was devastating. Survivors carried deep traumas that extended beyond their generation. Stories of silence prevailed among the affected, who found themselves unable to verbalize all that had happened. The inability to share these experiences perpetuated an isolation that marked entire families. On the other hand, the so-called war children inherited the psychological effects of these events, manifested in patterns of anxiety and difficulties in establishing interpersonal relationships. Many grew up without parents because they had died or were taken prisoner. Education during this period was characterized by severe deprivation, which affected social relationships and emotional development. One of the most representative cases of this stage was that of Allenstein, where hospitals, considered shelters for the wounded and vulnerable civilians, were turned into massacre sites between January 21st and 22nd, 1945. Red Army officers entered the Kortau Hospital, a district of Allenstein. All those present, including patients, medical staff, and refugees, were murdered. According to reports, around 500 people disappeared as a result of these attacks. The buildings were set on fire, and those fleeing were shot with rifles or killed with flamethrowers. The capture of Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia until then, by the Red Army in April 1945, led to unfortunate events against the civilian population. During the fighting, and after the local surrender, several residents, including Germans and Ukrainian forced laborers, suffered attacks. As in the rest of the region, there were reports of looting, rapes, murders, material losses, and displacement. The exact number of victims is debated, but it is assumed that several thousand dead were discovered in the days following the capture. After the war, Königsberg was renamed Kaliningrad, and the city became part of the Soviet Union, experiencing a radical change in its political and social structure. The German population was largely expelled or killed, while new settlers arrived from other parts of the Soviet Union, resulting in a mix of cultures. Of the approximately 2.5 million inhabitants of East Prussia before the offensive, it is estimated that around 300,000 people died. These figures include both those who perished from the direct causes of the armed confrontations and those who succumbed to the extreme conditions of the expulsions. The Nemmersdorf massacre: facts, propaganda, and historical debate. On October 21, 1944, during the Soviet offensive in the East Prussia region, the event known as the Nemmersdorf massacre occurred. This small village, located in a strategic region near the front line, was taken by Soviet troops after clashes with German defenses, which had established trench lines and fortifications in the area. After the retreat of the Third Reich's forces, the inhabitants of the village sought refuge in bunkers and other places they considered safe. Subsequent reports indicated that between 19 and 30 civilians were killed after the entry of Soviet troops, including 13 people who had sought protection in a bunker. The initial documentation of the events in Nemmersdorf came from the national troops who, upon returning to the village, found the remains of the victims. The bodies were initially discovered in an open grave and were only examined by order of a Wehrmacht officer. Among the dead were several women and some children, and the reports mentioned summary executions and, in some cases, particularly violent deaths. The bodies bore numerous bullet wounds, many of them in the head, suggesting they may have been selective executions. Some of the victims had been injured by other forms of violence, including a woman whose skull had been crushed by a sharp object. According to reports, a 19-year-old woman had been raped. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, used the events of Nemmersdorf to highlight the atrocities of the Red Army and mobilize both the armed forces and the civilian population for a final resistance against the Soviet advance. On October 27th, the newspaper Völkischer Beobachter, the official organ of the Nazi Party, published an article detailing the events in Nemmersdorf. It described the murders as part of an alleged systematic pattern of violence by Soviet forces. It also mentioned acts of torture and other forms of extreme violence, although some historians have pointed out that these official narratives may have exaggerated or distorted certain aspects of the events to fulfill political goals. Nazi propaganda also included visual material, such as photographs and newsreel footage, showing the bodies of the victims. Despite these efforts, their effectiveness was limited at a time when much of the population was demoralized due to military setbacks and the gradual deterioration of living conditions. To legitimize their version of the events, the Nazi regime called for an investigative commission that included foreign observers from neutral countries or Axis allies. On October 31st, the commission interrogated several witnesses, including Volkssturm member Emil Raduns, military court judge Paul Groch, Hans Hinrichs, and Charlotte Müller. Eberhard Taubert was responsible for instructing the witnesses before they were interrogated, suggesting that the statements were conditioned from the outset. The testimonies were designed to support the Nazi propaganda narrative. Raduns and Hinrichs, in particular, helped intensify the image by reporting on mass crimes such as rapes and kidnappings. However, this commission was criticized for its lack of impartiality, and the results of their investigations were seen as an attempt to support the official narrative. In the post-war period, the Nemmersdorf massacre became a subject of historical debate. In West Germany, the event was incorporated into narratives about the hardships suffered by the population during the conflict, particularly in the context of the mass expulsions. In East Germany and the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the events were minimized or reinterpreted as an example of Nazi propaganda, which contributed to the persistence of different interpretations of what happened. Author Bernhard Fisch, in his research on the Nemmersdorf massacre, questioned several aspects of the traditional accounts and proposed a revision of the established narratives. According to him, some of the testimonies and evidence presented by the propaganda of the time could have been manipulated, and he emphasized the need for a critical and balanced analysis of the available sources. Desperation in Demmin, the wave of mass suicides at the end of the conflict. Between April 30th and May 3rd, 1945, the city of Demmin was the scene of a wave of collective suicides involving between 800 and 1,000 people. The situation there began to deteriorate rapidly in the last months of the conflict. With the Wehrmacht in retreat and Soviet forces advancing from the east, the region became filled with rumors about the reprisals that Red Army soldiers might inflict on the civilian population. These fears were not unfounded, as there were numerous testimonies of looting, rapes, and summary executions carried out in other occupied areas. Additionally, Nazi propaganda had contributed to magnifying these threats, painting a picture of extreme brutality that fueled widespread panic among the inhabitants. The retreat of the Wehrmacht aggravated the situation. Before abandoning the city, they destroyed the main escape routes, including the 3 bridges that connected Demmin to surrounding areas. This left the population, which included both local residents and a large number of refugees from East Prussia and other eastern regions, with no way to flee. The Soviet arrival on April 30th triggered a series of events. Early in the afternoon of that day, they took the city without major combat. The first days of occupation were marked by acts of widespread violence. Although Soviet authorities had issued orders to control their troops, the reality on the ground was different. Numerous cases of looting for alcohol and valuables, arson and assaults on the civilian population occurred. In the face of the perception that there was no escape or protection possible, a few people began to consider suicide as the only viable option. The suicides took place in various ways. Several people drowned in the Peene, Tolense, and Treble rivers, which surround the urban settlement. Others chose hanging or the use of firearms. In many cases, entire families made the decision to die together. Parents would kill their children before ending their own lives, in an attempt to protect them from what they considered a worse fate. Scenes of bodies floating in rivers or hanging from trees and structures became part of the urban landscape during those days. The physical and emotional proximity between people trapped in Demmin fostered a kind of chain reaction. Fear and desperation spread quickly, and individual decisions to end one's life often influenced others to do the same. From a psychological point of view, this contagion phenomenon is common in extreme crisis situations where shared emotions can lead to collective behaviors. To explain this better, a local governess named Gisela Zimmer wrote in her diary on May 1st, "The people who committed suicide lost their heads over the meaning of life." Local authorities, who had been under the control of the National Socialist Party until shortly before the arrival of the Soviets, played an ambiguous role during these events. In some cases, they tried to maintain order and calm the population, but in others, they withdrew or actively participated in the suicides. That said, some locals resisted by becoming gunmen, attacking the invaders from their homes before killing themselves. After the conflict ended, the mass suicides of Demmin became a taboo topic for decades. In East Germany, the communist authorities avoided discussing the issue, as it could be interpreted as a criticism of Soviet forces. Meanwhile, in West Germany, the historical narrative focused on other aspects of the conflict and the Holocaust, leaving events like this in the background. It wasn't until the end of the Cold War that historians and journalists began to explore this episode in more depth. Although Demmin was exceptional in certain aspects, the events that took place there are part of a larger pattern of suicides that occurred in other parts of Germany during that period. Between wrath and law, acts of retaliation in Germany in 1945. German military personnel and civilians faced a series of acts of revenge carried out by the Allied forces as the war progressed, especially as it neared its end. In the final days of the conflict, for example, spontaneous acts of vengeance became common. After the liberation of concentration camps, such as Dachau at the end of April 1945, the camp held about 32,000 prisoners. The SS had previously tried to save them through the so-called death marches to prevent their liberation by the Allies. The American soldiers who arrived at the camp found it devastated and discovered a train carrying the bodies of about 2,300 prisoners who had died from hunger and disease. In an outburst of anger and indignation, some officers began shooting captured SS members, resulting in a spontaneous massacre in which an estimated 39 to 50 SS men were killed. Some prisoners were also added to the death toll. These actions were neither planned nor coordinated. They were simply the direct result of overwhelming emotions and accumulated suffering over years. However, there were also organized reprisals designed by specific groups seeking justice for Nazi crimes. A notable example was the actions of the Jewish Brigade, integrated into the British Army with nearly 5,000 Jews from Palestine, whose 16 members tracked down and executed Nazi war criminals extrajudicially. In some cases, these operations resulted in the execution of hundreds of people. Additionally, they fought on the front lines in Italy, participating in the liberation of cities like Ravenna and Bologna. A particularly well-known group, Nakam, even planned to poison the drinking water in Nuremberg with deadly poison to kill as many Germans as possible. The group had spied on water supply facilities and made the necessary preparations to carry out the poisoning. However, the plan was thwarted by several factors. Abakovna, the leader of the group, tried to obtain the poison in Palestine. Just before he could travel to Europe, he was arrested by the British military police. It is suspected that he was betrayed by Zionists, who saw such a reprisal as a threat to the establishment of the State of Israel. Kovna's companions then poured the poison into the sea. After Kovna's arrest, the group decided to abandon their plans and instead sought an alternative plan. They obtained arsenic and poisoned bread, which was delivered to a detention camp for SS members in Nuremberg. Although many SS men became ill, there were no fatalities. On the other hand, between the final year of the conflict and the following year, an estimated 900,000 women were victims of rape by Allied soldiers, although the most documented attacks were those committed by Soviet soldiers. These assaults were often not sanctioned, as the legal and administrative structures in Germany had collapsed, and the Allied commanders themselves tended to ignore or minimize the complaints. Judicial executions were also part of the post-war period. In the areas occupied by the Allies, military tribunals were set up to judge those responsible for war crimes. In the Western zones, over the 5 years following the war, 806 death sentences were handed down, more than half of which were carried out in special facilities, such as the war criminals' prison in Landsberg am Lech. In addition to Soviet looting, which we have already discussed, Americans, Britons, and French also participated in the appropriation of personal and public property, often justifying these actions as reprisals for the losses suffered during the conflict. This indiscriminate appropriation included everything from works of art to basic resources, which exacerbated the precariousness of the population in the early years of peace. One of the most impactful forms of structured repression occurred in the realm of reparations policies. While the United States implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe and stabilize Germany, the Soviet Union opted for a strategy of dismantling and transferring resources. This included transporting millions of tons of machinery, railway infrastructure, and raw materials to the communist power. France, on the other hand, had a mixed approach. In addition to participating in economic reparations efforts, it sought to regain control of territories like the Saar. Likewise, in the context of purges of collaborators, executions were carried out on people of various nationalities accused of collaborating with the Nazi regime. Building enemies, the propaganda strategy of the Allies. Propaganda played a crucial role in mobilizing populations and legitimizing the war effort in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, all of which used various forms of media such as posters, cinema, and radio for these purposes. In general terms, Adolf Hitler was portrayed as a figure who embodied evil on earth, a tyrannical leader whose actions caused the suffering brought by the war. National Socialism, for them, was an aggressive and expansionist ideology that threatened everything it touched or influenced. The Axis powers were presented as an alliance of totalitarian regimes based on oppression and violence. Propaganda linked National Socialism with fascism and militarism, creating an image of a global threat. The German people were often depicted as linked to National Socialism, which meant that everyone was seen as part of an aggressive and immoral regime. However, there were some efforts to frame the ruling class as the main culprits, attempting to create some empathy for the population of that country. Within that society, the soldier was portrayed in a ruthless light. Propaganda insisted that the troops of the Third Reich were cruel occupiers who oppressed civilians and committed war crimes. By creating a clear image of the enemy, the population was motivated to participate actively in the war effort. National identity and pride were also emphasized, highlighting the values of each society with their respective nuances. It is worth noting that both the Allies and the Axis powers used psychological strategies to sow doubts about the enemy's strength and undermine their morale. Leaflets were dropped to spread information about major events and influence both military personnel and civilians in the occupied territories. In the United States, posters played a central role, with one of the most iconic being the "I Want You" for U.S. Army recruitment poster, which urged the population to join the war effort. Hollywood also played a key role with productions like Why We Fight, which framed the war as a crusade against tyranny, portraying German soldiers as brutal figures. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, demonized Hitler from the outset. In particular, the BBC contributed to consolidating the sense of solidarity among citizens. One of their most notable efforts was satirical programs aimed at ridiculing the image of Hitler and his followers. Within the country, this was recognized as a particularly effective form of propaganda. Likewise, comedian Noel Coward released the song "Don't Let's Be Beastly to the Germans" in 1943, suggesting in the lyrics that his country should not be too cruel to Germans after victory. In France, propaganda took various forms, depending on the political context of the country. Before the occupation, posters urged the defense of the nation and promoted resistance. However, after the establishment of the Vichy government under the leadership of Philippe Pétain and his deputy Pierre Laval, propaganda was used to project an image of national unity under the new regime. The Vichy government proclaimed a national revolution that went against the principles of the French Revolution. Instead of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the new ideals were work, family, and fatherland. These messages were meant to create a sense of unity and national identity while justifying the regime's authoritarian control. Despite this, in the areas controlled by the resistance, materials continued to be produced that glorified the fight against the German occupation and denounced the crimes of the Third Reich. Cinema and radio were also employed to glorify the resistance and warn about the policies of the collaborationist government. In the Soviet Union, propaganda was used intensively in different formats. Posters, designed with a high level of artistic quality, depicted the enemy as a ruthless force, while highlighting the heroism of the Soviet people and the virtues of Stalinism. Leaflets often contained speeches by prominent politicians, such as Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, denouncing the Nazi aggression and calling for the defense of the homeland. Cinema played a fundamental role in constructing the patriotic discourse, with films that exalted the feats of the Red Army and promoted the idea of sacrifice for the motherland. Contrasts in Reconstruction, the two Germanys and their divergent paths. Once peace was established, more than a third of the German population lived in temporary shelters, often in improvised structures made of prefabricated corrugated iron with semicircular roofs, known as Nissenhütten. The hygienic conditions in these spaces were inadequate, leading to health problems. Several families lived in the same hut, with rooms separated by thin walls. Reports indicate that around 42,000 people lived in various camps of these shelters in Hamburg alone. On the other hand, the removal of rubble and the reconstruction of cities were urgent tasks, considering that around 16 million homes were destroyed by the war, creating an enormous demand for housing. The removal of rubble was carried out by various groups. Initially, German prisoners and former members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party were used. However, these groups were insufficient, so help was sought from the population. In the Western occupation zone, this was mostly voluntary, while in the Soviet zone, forced labor prevailed. Many women, often called rubble women, contributed to the cleanup, although many men also participated. The work was often stigmatized and considered low status. The risks involved were numerous. The tasks were carried out in unsafe conditions because the ruins were unstable, and fatal accidents could occur. In addition, the workers were exposed to health risks such as dust, moisture, and sharp objects. Psychological stress was also high, as many people had lost family or friends among the rubble. The duration of the rubble removal process varied considerably by area. In Berlin, it was estimated that between 6 and 8 years would be needed for cleanup. Later estimates suggested a period of 20 to 25 years, even using the most modern techniques. By the end of 1947, in North Rhine-Westphalia, only 10% of the rubble had been cleared, while in Munich, 43% had been cleaned. Despite the initial difficulties, the 1950s saw a remarkable construction boom, resulting in the creation of approximately 3 million homes in the Federal Republic of Germany. This led to intense debates about how the destroyed cities should be designed. Some architects and urban planners advocated for a radical restart, proposing a vanguard approach to urban planning, while traditionalists defended the restoration of cities with attention to their historical past. The economies of the two Germanys developed in completely different ways. In the Federal Republic of Germany, economic recovery began in 1948, especially after the currency reform, which stabilized the Deutschmark and returned to market economy principles. The production capacities remained largely intact at around 85%, which favored a faster recovery. The Marshall Plan, which came into effect that same year, provided significant financial resources that were invested in reconstruction. The economy experienced strong growth in the 1950s, known as the economic miracle. Investments increased significantly, and the gross national product rose substantially. Full employment was achieved, and real wages continuously increased. Structural changes toward an industrial economy and, later, a service-oriented economy occurred rapidly. In contrast, the economy of the German Democratic Republic was characterized by a centrally planned economy. After the war, companies were nationalized, and the economy was directly controlled by state authorities in the Soviet style. This country faced various challenges, including a shortage of raw materials and inefficient production methods. Economic development was slower than in the Federal Republic of Germany, and there were frequent shortages of consumer goods. The government tried to stabilize the economy through public investments and planning measures, but the results did not meet expectations. The separation between the two states also created different living conditions for the population. In the Federal Republic of Germany, the standard of living continuously increased, while in its socialist neighbor, the population faced numerous restrictions, generating discontent.